Okay, hello. My fault. Hello. Hello. Good morning. We're going to be doing Rockford reading today. Again, we're going to pick up with "Freedom is a Constant Struggle" by Angela Y. Davis. Let me know how the audio sound. Had a slight mishap with the headphones, so let me know. Comment below how the audio sound. Okay, we're gonna pick back up in chapter 7. We're going to start chapter 7 over, just in the interest of telling the story the best. So, okay. So, chapter 7 is called The Truth Telling Project, Violence in America. And let me know. Audio good? Hold on. Good? Okay. Thank you. And again, right here from Say the Name Square, this is a memorial for Lil Mike Sago, who was 16 years old when he was murdered by Winnebago County Sheriff's Deputy Frank Pubjecki. And Frank Pubjecki is still a sheriff officer, sheriff deputy today. Meanwhile, the people that was with Lil Mike Sago, people like his older brother Lamar Coates, people like his cousin Brandon Sago, people like Desmond Bellman, they are all sitting in jail for the murder of Lil Mike Sago, even though it was Frank Pubjecki that shot and killed their cousin or their brother, even though it was Frank Pubjecki that shot Desmond Bellman, even though it was Frank Pubjecki that shot Lamar Coates, even though it was Frank Pubjecki that shot Brandon Sago, they were all punished for his death because Frank Pubjecki murdered him. Okay. So we're going to pick back up at chapter 7. Chapter 7 is called The Truth Telling Project, Violence in America. And this is taken from a speech given in St. Louis, Missouri in January 27, 2015. Okay. So we go. Kudos to Pastor Corey Bush and Dr. David Ragland for their brilliant work on the Truth Telling Project. I deeply thank you for inviting me to participate in this gathering of Ferguson protesters and other activists in the St. Louis area. It was an honor to join you as you ponder the permanence of violence in America, and as you explore the old and new meanings and long-standing but unacknowledged truths about the vicious racism that has plagued our world since its beginnings. We know that the historical process of colonization was a violent conquest of human beings in the land they stewarded. It is thus essential that we identify the genocidal assaults on the first peoples of this land as a foundational arena for the many forms of state and vigilante violence that followed. The violence of European colonization, including the slave trade, constitutes the common history of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the American Hemisphere. In other words, there is a longer and larger history of the violence we witness today. Our understandings of and resistance to contemporary modes of racist violence should thus be sufficiently capacious to acknowledge the embeddedness of historical violence, of settler colonial violence against Native Americans, and of the violence of slavery inflicted on Africans. Our work today is evidence of the unfinished status of planetary struggles for equality, justice, and freedom. And again, I'm gonna bring this up one last time. The book that I'm reading right now, not this one, but the book that I'm reading outside of this, it's A People's History of the United States. And it really, I say this every time I talk about it, I have learned more about America's history and America's true history reading and I'm not all the way done with it, reading halfway through the book than I ever known. Reading through that book and them talking about how there was wars to get all this land, and how the wars were set up, and how the wars were orchestrated to where they could freely and openly attack the indigenous people of this land. To where, I don't know, I'm just gonna recommend everybody to read that book. And learn more about the true history, not the history that they teach you in your history class, or the history they teach you in situations where situations where white people can decide what history to tell and what version of history to tell. And more often than not, they paint the picture, they tell the story of the thing that paints them in the best light. People drive crazy out here. Okay. I think all of the presenters for their truth-telling presentations, including my sister. How do you say that? Fanaya Davis, who has been working with this project since her first trip to Ferguson. It has been almost 1 year since the protests last summer following the police killing of Michael Brown. This morning, my sister and I touched the ground where he was slain and followed the path of the protesters through the Ferguson community. I know that there are many Ferguson protesters among you, and I want you to know how honored I feel to be here in this place at this time. Like everyone else who identifies with current struggles against racism and police violence, I have uttered the words Ferguson and Michael Brown innumerable times, both inside and outside the country. For me, as for people throughout the world, the very mention of Ferguson evokes struggle, perseverance, courage, and a collective vision of the future. Let me share a story about the global renaissance of your perseverance. Last September, when I traveled to, Savona? I'm going to say Savona. Last September, when I traveled to Savona, Italy, a town of about 60,000 people in northwestern Italy near Genoa, where I was invited to speak on the Cuban Five. The people there were eagerly following the Ferguson protests. The group to which I spoke had been working for many years to free the Cubans who were arrested by the U.S. government in 1998 for attempting to prevent terrorist assaults on Cuba. As you may know, the last three were released this past December in a prisoners' exchange. As we gather here this evening, the city of Johannesburg is celebrating the Cuban Five as heroes who represent the collective determination generated by people throughout the world in the uninterrupted 16-year-long struggle for their freedom. The point that I want to make is that when I arrived in Savona, the people were also enthusiastically waiting to hear about Michael Brown and Ferguson. They interpreted the actions of the protesters in Ferguson as a blow for freedom all over the planet, including freedom for the Cuban Five. My primary reason for being here this afternoon is not to offer you leadership or to impart advice as to where to go from here. While I would be happy to engage in such discussions, that is not why I am here. I am here simply because I want to thank you, Ferguson activists, because you refuse to drop the struggle. My fault. Let me start that over. I am here simply because I want to thank you, Ferguson activists, because you refuse to drop the torch of struggle. When you were urged to go home and go back to business as usual, you said no. And in the process, you made Ferguson a worldwide symbol of resistance. At a time when we are urged to settle for fast solutions, easy answers, and formulaic resolutions, Ferguson protesters said no. You were determined to continue to make the issues of violence against black communities visible. You refused to believe that there were any simplistic answers, and you demonstrated that you would not allow this issue to be buried in the graveyard that has not only claimed black lives, but also so many struggles to defend those lives. So I join the millions of people who thank you for not giving up, for not going home, for staking our claim for freedom on the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, with such great power that Ferguson has become synonymous with progressive protests from Palestine to South America, from Palestine to South Africa, from Syria to Germany, and to Brazil to Australia. I am especially moved to be here where it all began. When Mike Brown was killed almost a year ago, Ferguson activists proclaimed that they were standing up not only for this young man whose life was needlessly sacrificed, but also for countless others. If it had not been for Ferguson, we might not have been compelled to focus our attention on let's see, where are we? Okay. If it had not been for Ferguson, we might not have been compelled to focus our attention on Eric Garner in New York, and 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Cleveland, and Walter Scott in North Charleston, South Carolina, and Freddie Gray in Baltimore. If it had not been for Ferguson, we might not have remembered. I apologize, I might mess up these names. Miriam Carey in Washington, D.C., Rekia Boyd in Chicago, and Alicia Thomas in Los Angeles. Had it not been for Ferguson protesters who also pointed out that black women and people of color and queer communities and Palestinian activists were targets of officially condoned racist violence, we might not have achieved such a broad consciousness of the work that will be required to build a better world. We might not have experienced the terrible tragedy in Charleston in ways that have been brought together. We might not have experienced the terrible tragedy in Charleston in ways that have brought together people all over the world. We recognize that racism is indeed alive and well, 15 years into the 21st century. We might not have recognized that we have to focus our attention beyond individuals and symbols in order to develop a fluency capable of apprehending the persistence of structural racism, even when legalized segregation has been declared historically obsolete. Even when individual expressions of racist attitudes are not so easily condoned. Of course, it is a good thing that the Confederate flag is finally on the way out. That's nuts to hear her say that. When was this? In 2014, so that's 7 years ago. That's seven years ago, and she's talking about how the Confederate flag... Oh, no, my fault. It is 2015. That's 6 years ago. To hear talk about how the Confederate flag is finally on the way out, and to know that it's still, 6 years later, that it's still not something that we have fully accomplished. That's still something that people are real heavy for the Confederate flag. People are really fighting for the Confederate flag. After more than 50 years of openly symbolizing resistance to civil rights, resistance to black equality, and anti-black and anti-Semitic violence, the Confederate flag finally seems to be finally disappearing from our official political landscapes. But the question confronting us is how to identify and challenge structures as well as symbols of racism. It is quite interesting that in the very last period of Obama's presidency, the Pandora's box of racism has been unbolted. But many are rushing to close it again. In 2011, when Troy Davis faced capital punishment, we desperately tried to build a movement strong enough to save his life. But public understandings of the centrality of the death penalty But public understandings of the centrality of the death penalty to the persistence of structural racism were not strong enough to create a collective demand that cannot be ignored. In 2012, when Trayvon Martin was killed, the cry, "Justice for Trayvon Martin," awakened people to the urgency of building anti-racist movements. But we focused somewhat too sharply on George Zimmerman, the individual perpetuator, to be able to identify the structures of racist violence and specifically the links between vigilante violence and state violence. But when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, the movement refused to disband. Even when the police used military technology and tactics to subdue the protesters, they refused to be restrained. Palestinian activists, accustomed to police attacks with tear gas, tweeted advice and encouragement to Ferguson protesters. When some people's rage led them to respond in ways that may have been counterproductive, the movement did not capitulate and refused to disband. Even when people tried to discredit the protesters, the movement refused to disband. When various public figures asked, "Where are the leaders?" the movement said, "We are not a leaderless movement. We are a leaderful movement." Your movement announced that we do not need the traditional recognized black male charismatic leader. We definitely love Martin and Malcolm and deeply appreciate their historical contributions, but we need not replicate the past. Besides, this is the 21st century, and by now we should have learned that leadership is not a male prerogative. Women have always... My fault. Okay. That's where we are. Women have always done the work of organizing black radical movements. So women should also be in the leadership. Within the black movement, we have engaged in these struggles around gender from the beginning of the 20th century, and especially in the 1960s and the 1970s. Finally, we see a movement that values radical black women, that values radical black queer women. When black women stand up, as they did during the Montgomery bus boycott, as they did during the Black Liberation era, earth-shaking changes occur. But as activist historian Barbara Ransby has emphasized. We cannot romanticize leaderlessness. She recently pointed out that those who romanticize the concept of leaderless movements often misleadingly deploy Ella Baker's words, "Strong people don't need a leader." Baker delivered this message in various iterations over her 50-year career working in the trenches of racial justice struggles. But what she meant was specific and contextual. She was calling for people to disinvest from the notion of the messianic, charismatic leader who promises political salvation in exchange for deference. Baker also did not mean that movements would naturally emerge without collective analysis, serious strategizing, organizing, mobilizing, and consensus building. New organizations such as Black Lives Matter, Dream Defenders, Black Youth Project 100, Justice League NYC, and We Charge Genocide are a few of the new generation organizations that have developed new models of leadership and that acknowledge how important black feminist insights are to the development of viable 21st century radical black movements. These organizations understand the clandestine racialization and gendering of punitively universal categories. They recognize, for example, that those who counter the slogan Black Lives Matter with what they assume is a more embracing slogan, All Lives Matter, are often embracing a strategy that glosses over the particular reasons why it is. What's going on? Okay, my fault. Oh, okay. Let's see. My fault. I lost my place. Okay. Let me start this over. Send this over. They recognize, for example, that those who counter the slogan Black Lives Matter with what they assume is a more all-embracing slogan, All Lives Matter, are often embracing a strategy that glosses over the particular reasons why it is so important to insist, quite specifically, on an end to racist violence. I understand that Hillary Clinton spoke at a church a few days ago, some 5 miles from Ferguson, where she insisted that all lives matter. I don't remember this. And at the same time, I was like 15 at the time. I'm going to have to go back and read that. Alright, listen to that. Does she not realize that is something that, let me start there. That is something that this book has done, that a lot of the material comes from the early 2013, 2014 time period. And I was 13, 14 years old. So it has made me, there are certain incidents, certain things that I remember watching on TV or hearing about on social media, and I remember my parents talking to me about and things like that, things of that nature. But to have them just laying out like this and out in the open is nuts to think that all these things are happening, and I'm 13 years old just worrying about I hope I do good on my midterms or something. So it's nuts to read this. And important to read this. Okay. Does she not realize the extent to which does she not realize the extent to which such universal proclamations have always bolstered racism? More often than not, my fault. More often than not, universal categories have been clandestinely racialized. Any critical engagement with racism requires us to understand the tyranny of the universe. For most of our history, the very category human For most of our history, the very category human has not embraced black people and people of color. Its abstractedness has been colored white and gendered male. I wonder if Hillary Clinton is familiar with the book, All the Women Are White, All the Black People Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave. If indeed all lives mattered, we would not need to emphatically proclaim that Black Lives Matter, or, as we discover on the BLM website, Black Women Matter, Black Girls Matter, Black Gay Lives Matter, Black Bi Lives Matter, Black Boys Matter, Black Queer Lives Matter, Black Men Matter, Black Lesbians Matter, Black Trans Lives Matter, Black Immigrants Matter, Black Incarcerated Lives Matter, Black Differently Abled Bodies, Black Differently Abled Lives Matter. Yes, Black Lives Matter. Latino, Asian American, Native American, Muslim, poor and working class white people's lives matter. There are many more specific instances we would have to name before we can ethically and comfortably proclaim that all lives matter. Let me wait for this bus to go by. Okay. In this context, I want to take to issue with one of Obama's points in his quite amazing eulogy in Charleston, South Carolina yesterday. I want to take issue with what he said when he exclaimed that if we want to be successful in our struggle against racism, we cannot say that we need more conversations about race. Rather, we should say we need action. Certainly, we need a great deal more than talk. But it is also the case that we need to learn how to talk about race and racism. If we do not know how to meaningfully talk about racism, our actions will move in misleading directions. The call for public conversations on race and racism is also a call to develop a vocabulary that permits us to have insightful conversations. If we attempt to use historically obsolete vocabularies, our consciousness of racism will remain shallow, and we can be easily urged to assume that. For example, changes in the law spontaneously produce effective changes in the social world. For example, those who assume that because slavery was legally abolished in the 19th century, it was thereby regulated to the dustbin of history, failed to recognize the extent to which cultural and structural elements of slavery are still with us. The prison industrial complex furnishes numerous examples of the persistence of slavery. There are those who believe that we have definitively triumphed in the struggle for civil rights. However, vast numbers of black people are still deprived of the right to vote, especially if they are in prison or former felons. Even those who did acquire rights, that were not previously available to them, did not thereby achieve jobs, education, housing, and healthcare. The mid-20th century campaign for civil rights was an essential movement in our struggle for racial equality. But it is important to develop vocabularies to help us acknowledge that civil rights was and is not the entire story. Such an analysis of racism will be helpful to those who are celebrating yesterday's Supreme Court decision on marriage equality as if the final barrier to justice for the LGBTQ communities has been surmounted. The decision was indeed historic. The decision was indeed historic, but the struggles against homophobic state violence, for economic rights, healthcare, etc., continue. Most importantly, if the intersectionality of struggles against racism. Wait for this. Okay. Most importantly, if the intersectionality of struggles against racism, homophobia, and transphobia is minimized, we will never achieve significant victories in our fight for justice. This is yet another reason why it is essential to develop richer and more critical vocabularies for which to express our insights about racism. Okay. While she's talking about this, I do want to just take this moment and pause and say that what she's specifically talking about right here in this paragraph about homophobic state violence, about transphobia, that is something that we have seen as protesters, as a collective of protesters. We've seen, I've been in jail and seen some of the COs openly and blatantly misgender people. I've seen slurs be thrown around and things of that nature. So I do want to say that the homophobic state violence is a huge problem in the Rockford Police Department. It is a huge problem in the Winnebago County Sheriff's Department. It's a huge problem in the jail. Transphobia is a huge problem in the Rockford Police Department. Transphobia is a huge problem in the Sheriff's Department. And transphobia is a huge problem in the jail. And that is something... Oh, my fault. Okay. So while she's talking about all these things on a global level, on a national level, that it is important, evident here, that is something... that is why I... Never mind. Let me just get back into reading. Okay. Let me see. Okay. The inability to understand the complexities of racism can lead to assumptions, for example, that there is an independent phenomenon that we call black-on-black crime that has nothing to do with racism. So the development of new ways of thinking about racism requires us not to only understand economic, social, and ideological structures, but also collective psychic structures. One of the major examples of violence of racism consists of the rearing of generations of black people who have not learned how to imagine the future. We are not in possession of the education and the imagination that allows them to envision the future. Excuse me. This is violence that leads to other forms of violence. Violence violence against children, violence against partners, violence against friends, in our families and communities, we often unconsciously continue the work of larger forces of racism, assuming that this violence is individual. If the popularization of more complex analysis of racism, especially those that have been developed in the context of black and women of color feminists, can assist us to understand how deeply embedded racist violence is in our country's economic and ideological structures. These ways of talking about racism can help us to grasp the global reach of our struggles. Palestinian Americans' involvement in the Ferguson protests was allowed. Good morning. Palestinian Americans' involvement in the Ferguson protests was complemented by expressions of solidarity with Ferguson from Palestinian activists in the West Bank and Gaza. The Ferguson struggle has taught us that local issues have global ramifications. The militarization of the Ferguson police and the advice tweeted by Palestinian activists help to recognize our political kinship with the boycott, divestment, and the sanctions movement, and with a larger struggle for justice in Palestine. Wait for these. We have to come to understand the central role of Islamophobia. Of Islamophobia has played in the emergence of the new forms of racism in the aftermath of September 11th, 2001. Deep understandings of racist violence arm us against deceptive solutions. When we are told that we simply need better police and better prisons, we counter with what we really need. We need to reimagine security, which will involve the abolition of policing, and imprisonment as we know it. We will say demilitarize the police, disarm the police, and abolish the institution of the police as we know it, and abolish imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment. But we will have only just begun to tell the truth about the violence in America. So that is the conclusion of chapter 7. That is the conclusion. How much more of this book we got left? It is an excellent book. Okay. We got a little over 50 more pages. Okay, so then we go on to chapter 8. And chapter 8 is called... My fault, I thought I heard something. Okay. Chapter 8 is called Feminism and Abolition, Theories and Practices for the 21st Century. And this is taken from a speech delivered as the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture annual public lecture, in the collaboration with the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality at the University of Chicago. It's a long title. And this took place on May 4th, 2013. Let me say, this is the first time in many years that I have spent an extended period of time in Chicago. That is to say, 4 days. 4 whole days. And if yesterday and today felt like Chicago, my fault. And if yesterday and today felt like the Chicago I've always known, Tuesday and Wednesday were the most beautiful days in the city I've ever experienced. And I started to think, I can live in Chicago. until the wind and the cold returned yesterday. But I still like Chicago. And it is wonderful to be here, no matter what the season might be. This amazing city has such a history of struggle. It's the city of the Haymarket Martyrs, the city of radical labor unions, the city of resistance to the police assassinations of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. It's the city of Puerto Rican activism against colonialism. It is a city of immigrant rights activists. And of course, it is a city of the Chicago Teachers Union. Now, a few years ago, Chicago was a city that developed a revived national movement to support Assata Shakur. And I remember Lisa Brock and Derek Cooper, Tracy Matthews, Beth E. Ritchie, Kathy Cohen, and others called for a renewed campaign to defend the rights and the life of Assata Shakur. Oh no, it's starting to rain. Yeah, it's starting to rain. Oh no. No. Okay, we can wrap up. We can wrap up real quick. Actually. Yeah, it's starting to rain. We're gonna wrap up real quick.